Rendering modes in Blazor can be a confusing topic, but in this video, my goal is to help you understand what they are in the simplest way possible. If you are just getting started with Blazor, then you will realize that rendering modes form a key part of the development process. Understanding what the various render modes are and how they impact the development of your C# application or your Blazor application is crucial in building highly performant and production-ready systems. A Blazor application is fundamentally made up of building blocks called components. These components are made up of both your HTML logic and your C# code behind. So as a developer, it's your job to find a way to put all these components together in a way to build a very optimized system. So what are render modes? Render modes determine how the component is rendered and where the execution of the application takes place. For example, you can both render and execute your HTML on the server first and then give it to the clients later on. Or you can render your HTML on the server, but then it will get executed on the client. So as shown in the code we have below, render modes in C# are defined using the render mode directive like we have here. You can put this globally. Over here in the example is put on a component level, but we can put it globally. But for this tutorial, we'll use the per component model, which is usually the default strategy of defining it, right? So this table we have here summarizes all the various types of render modes that we have in an easy to absorb manner, right? So we have the static server render mode, and for each render mode we have description, and then I put over here the render location as well, the interactivity to help give you a quick glance of what they are before we go a bit deeper into them, right? So we have the static server, which is the static server side rendering, which is the default render mode in Blazor. And for this, your HTML, your logic gets compiled on the server, which means the render location is the server. But this comes with zero interactivity. So if you can define things like button clicks and mouse moves and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that really shortly. Then we have the interactive server mode. So the interactive server render mode, for that, your logic gets rendered, or it gets compiled on the server, and then it gets presented to the client. Now, interactive server, I believe is the best selling point of Blazor. It's what makes Blazor really amazing, because you get the power of the server side rendering, and then yes, so you get the interactivity of the client side. So it's beautiful. I love it. Right now we have the interactive web assembly. Now this is where your code and then your logic all gets compiled by the browser, using the Blazor web assembly, as we will describe later on. And this, obviously, because it's client side, it's interactive, right? So you can add interactivity to it. But the downsides of interactive web assembly is that you don't have access to the typical server side stuff you'd have done. For example, directly querying the database or stuff like that. So you have to do it through endpoints or things like that, and that is the interactive web assembly. Now, interactive auto is also really beautiful. Okay, so what happens is that this combines the best of both worlds, right? So on the first load of your component, right, the server is what handles the rendering, and then behind the scenes, the browser loads the web assembly, the .NET web assembly, or the runtime behind the scenes in the background. So the next time that you visit that same component, it renders with the web assembly on the client, and this is beautiful as well. And this also supports interactivity. So now let's get into each of the modes individually. Right, so static server rendering. So as we mentioned, this is where your code and your logic is compiled on the server side, and then it's sent to the client. But this does not allow for any interactivity. So if you have things like buttons where you put like event handlers on it, it will not respond to it. It will not work. So most of the time, for static server side rendering, you use it when it's just bare content. bare dynamic content which doesn't really require any type of feedback from your client or from the end user. This is where you use it, and this is very fast. So once you check your developer tools console, you realize that your HTML and then your logic is all compiled right from the server into the response stream. So that is for static server-side rendering. Now let's look at a code example for this. So in the following example, you realize that there's no destination for the component's render mode. So the component inherits the render mode from its parent. Now, since no ancestor component specifies a render mode, then the following component is statically rendered on the server, right? So because we've not specified any render mode directive, then by default, it's just statically rendered on the server. So the button we have here, which says click me, once you click the button on the website, it doesn't do any page updates, right? So the value of message over here, it doesn't change at all. And the component isn't rendered in response to UI event. Now, interactive server-side rendering. So for interactive server-side rendering, the components, it renders the component interactively from the server using Blazor server, right? So the user interactions, as we see here, they are handled in real time. This is so amazing. They are handled in real time via a WebSocket, a Signal-R WebSocket connection, right? And the button, and we'll look at a code example very soon. Okay, so once the server sends the component to the browser, the circuit connection is established. All right, and then whatever interactivity that happens, it is handled in the real-time connection between the server and the client. So you are getting the best of both worlds. All right, both the server side rendering, you are getting some interactivity as well, and then your component also still has access to certain server side functions and methods that you will not have gotten access to on a normal day. So this is really the best of both worlds. And most of the time you may end up preferring this mode over other modes, but we'll check out the other mode. It all depends on what you are trying to achieve. Also, one thing you have to know is that with this particular type of mode, it may not be always good if you are really doing this at scale. Just a little bit server performance hit may be taken because of the real-time connection. If you don't optimize properly, then you may end up having a bit of performance issues because the server has to maintain the type of connection between itself and then the client. So, and also if your end users do not have very good connectivity, then it may also be an issue. So these are things that you should consider when in this mode. Okay, so over here we have an example. The render mode, as we see here, is set to interactive server, and we add it by adding the render mode interactive server like we have over here to the component. The button over here calls the update message, right? Then the value of the message actually changes, right? And the component is rendered to update the message in the UI. All right, so this actually works out because of that real-time connection we have with the server and then the client. So even though this is rendered from the server, it still maintains connectivity with the client, and then it perfectly handles this type of UI interaction. Okay, so the client-side rendering. So for this, no server involved, right? The .NET runtime and app bundle are downloaded and cached when the assembly component is initially rendered. So components using the client-side rendering must be built from a separate client project, that sets up the Blazor web assembly host. So just like what we see over here, the entire .NET, not the entire .NET web assembly, but then a light version of the runtime is actually uploaded onto the browser. Okay, and then it is cached as well, so you don't have to download it. The browser doesn't download it several times anytime you visit the component. It's just one time, and every other time it just uses it unless you specifically delete it. So this makes it extremely fast and then efficient. So let's look at example of how we will declare a component as an interactive WebAssembly, right? So over here in our code example, we have the render mode as interactive WebAssembly, and this is the directive that we use to determine when a component is like that. So for this one, obviously, it has access to all the interactivity the browser gives you, all the browser level APIs. It has access to everything like any front end application will have, right? So once you click this button, this message over here is actually updated, and then you see the components refresh on your screen. All right. Okay, so now let's go to the next one, which is the automatic interactive auto rendering. Okay, this is also a very interesting one. Okay, so what happens is that this is a twin of interactive server and interactive WebAssembly. So what happens is that when you visit the components, the server first uses interactive server to render that particular component. Then behind the scenes, it downloads the .NET runtime, live version runtime, and then the web assembly behind the scenes. So you get how it works like. So on the first load of the component, you have the interactive server being used where the real-time connection is established, right? But then behind the scenes, the web assembly is being downloaded. So anytime you revisit that particular component, it doesn't use interactive server anymore. It uses the web assembly now. And this is a very interesting aspect. So you get very good optimization because the .NET runtime and the app bundle, they are all downloaded to the client in the background, and then they are cached. So then on future visits, you can you enjoy the best of both sides. You see the highly performance nature of the app. So you basically get the best of both worlds, and then that is the speed of the server side rendering and also the interactivity of the client side. And this is interactive auto. So you can also say that the final state, not you can't say final state, but the end state of the component that is being rendered is going to be on the client side. So that is for interactive auto. Now let's look at a code example. So we have for this one, we defined the state, the render mode with render mode interactive auto like we have here. So the component is interactive throughout the process. So even though you have the first server-side rendering, it doesn't mean that on the first load you don't have any interactivity, because on the first load it uses the interactive server. You still have interactivity throughout the process. So the button, once it calls the update message, the value of the message actually changes, and the component is re-rendered to update the message in the UI. So initially, like we said, the component is rendered interactively from the server, but on subsequent visits, it's rendered from the client, after the runtime, and then the app bundle is downloaded and cached. So this is how interactive auto works. Beginning goes with the server side interactive server, then it ends with the interactive web assembly. Okay, so this is also really amazing. Now, so a summary of the render modes we talked about. So in this video, we have talked about the 4 render modes in Blazor. Hopefully this video helps to clear, all the confusions you have about this concept. We've talked about static server-side rendering. We talked about interactive server. So static server, we said it doesn't, there's no interactivity. For interactive server, it's rendered from the server, but then the execution can still happen on the client because of the real-time communication that the server maintains with the client. Therefore, interactive web assembly is rendered solely on the client, and you don't have access to server-side stuff, right? Then interactive auto, it first renders with interactive server, then after it renders with interactive web assembly, okay, behind the scenes. So you have the best of both worlds. So don't hesitate to ask any additional questions in the comment section. I hope I was able to clarify your confusions about the Blazor rendering modes. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I do hope to see you in the next one.